Hello and welcome to the Collegian Football Podcast. Ben Ferree joined by Evan Patrick with our second episode in this new format where we're on YouTube. I have a new location today from the first episode. I think we might just make this a trend, see how many different locations we can get in for each episode. But yeah, you can see our faces now in video on YouTube. We're also still Spotify, SoundCloud, all of that jazz. But before we get in today's episode where we kind of break down Mike Yurcich's first press conference as the new Penn State offensive coordinator, just Evan, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Yeah, it's an exciting time, I guess, in terms of the offseason where there's not a whole lot going on, but with a lot of relevant news for Penn State in the college football world, and also an exciting week for us. It's both of our birthday weeks this week. Your birthday yesterday. Happy belated birthday. My birthday on Sunday for the Super Bowl, and yeah, 22 years ago we were put on this earth, destined to be doing this podcast right now. So it's exciting times.
Absolutely. We're fully old men now. I don't know. I just feel like 22 feels old when you say it, which I know people are going to yell at me and make fun of me that it's not old, but it feels a lot older than like 21 does. But yeah, we're another year. Well, I'm another year wiser for this episode. You're soon to be another year wiser. But yeah, a fun little birthday week. I remember we discovered that we we're so close to having the same birthday. But anyway, you probably don't care about our birthdays. Also, I have to shout out that my background today, I'm in my childhood home right now. I'm just down in our basement, and like we have my old elementary school painting there, and also my mom has this like owl painting from like a paint night she did. So enjoy the art in the background, I guess. Hopefully it's not too distracting. I know the owl's kind of scary if you look at them in the right light, but overall hope you enjoy the art. But anyway, kind of getting into this episode, Mike Yurcich, he was introduced with a introductory press conference this week, and I think the first thing we should take away from it is he was asked very early on, I mean, what is this offense going to be? Of course, he's been kind of all over the place, most recently with Texas, but he's been in Oklahoma State, Ohio State. He's been around the block, seen a lot of different offenses, been with a lot of different high-profile quarterbacks and so on. But he simply said this is not a Mike Yurcich offense. This is going to be a Penn State offense, and it's going to be built on these three key traits: being tough, being smart, and being skilled. And those are the three traits that he repeated multiple times in that answer: tough, smart, skilled. And my first takeaway from this was that it's going to be a Penn State offense was very similar to what Kirk Ciarrocca said when he was introduced last year. I was going to be a blend of the two offenses. What he came from Minnesota, what James Franklin already had. Like you're just doing a similar kind of thing there. But I think after the year Penn State had, tough, smart, skilled are three good benchmarks for this offense to reach.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, throughout that press conference, I was pretty impressed with Yurcich and everything he was saying. I mean, he seems like a guy. He's a real football guy, and he seems like a really sharp offensive mind who really kind of gets the modern side of the game and where the game is going. He said all the right things, and yeah, I also really thought that was important when he said this isn't going to be simply a Mike Yurcich offense. It's going to be a Penn State offense, and that's key because James Franklin, you don't get rid of a guy like Kirk Ciarrocca after one season if there's not something at least somewhat drastic that you want to change. And Franklin is probably bringing in Yurcich, one, because they do have a history in Pennsylvania. They've known each other. Yurcich said that even prior to this year that he's had talks about working with James before. And you bring this guy in because, one, you like what he's done. He has a great resume. He's probably one of the best hires in terms of offensive coordinators that was out there in the market this offseason. But two, you think that you can blend your offensive philosophies together to create something better than what you just had in the 2020 season. And from everything we've heard, I feel like that Franklin and his staff brought in Ciarrocca, and then maybe that he got there and not everything meshed how they really expected it to do so. And I think that this version of the Penn State offense is going to be, I think it's going to be visibly different enough and more back to maybe similar stuff that Joe Moorhead and Ricky Ronnie's offenses looked like in past seasons with Yurcich. I think that's kind of the biggest takeaway from what he said early on in that press conference. And I think we got a lot of good stuff from Yurcich about his philosophical thoughts on how just offense in college football and football in general right now. He talked about how tempo is such a key thing in football these days. And being able to play a high tempo, no huddle at times, and just keeping defenses on the field, wearing them out mentally and physically, being able to minimize the amount of communication that defenses can get to one another, position group to position group pre-snap. And you do things like that with hurry up offenses, pre-snap motion, just to really throw them off. And that's really, if you follow the trends of what really smart offensive coordinators have been doing at the pro level and at the college level, that's the goal. Is you got to be able to throw off defenses. You got to be able to keep them on their toes and create as much miscommunication as possible. And that was a huge emphasis of when he's talking about his philosophies and his goals in bringing this offense to State College.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's one of the big things that stuck out to me too was tempo, which will be drastically different than what we saw this past season for Penn State. And like you said, kind of a return to those Joe Moorhead, Ricky Ronnie days. Another thing that kind of stuck out to me was you're just saying how games are won up front, games are won in the trenches. It's a joke that we always make how much I love offensive linemen and talking about offensive linemen, but it really is true. I mean, they're such a big part of the game and a big part of a winning formula for a team. So that's something he came out right away and said, like, we have to be very physical up front. We have to recruit well on the offensive line. And I mean, I think with Philip Trotween as the offensive line coach, there's some good steps there for this Penn State offensive line where it could really become dominant. And that's something that Penn State's probably going to need should they continue to be successful and grow into what a program that reach the things that they want to aspire to be. But he also said, an emphasis on having players formations play like it's not just a system and then like, oh, we're going to put people into this system. It's going to be a system that kind of tailors to the players, kind of put them in formations that's best for them to succeed, and then like give them plays that highlights the strengths. And I think that's something that Penn State really has missed. I mean, I think Joe Moorhead did a good job at that when he was here. I mean, you saw that when Penn State made the Big Ten championship run and all of that. But I think it's something that James Franklin has kind of struggled with since coming into Penn State, at least in my opinion, was James Franklin has his system and then not always adapting it to the personnel fully. I think a great example of that was Christian Hackenberg, right? I mean, that's going back now a couple of years, but I mean, Christian Hackenberg was a pocket passing quarterback and was kind of thrown into James Franklin's like spread running quarterback style. So I mean, I think that's something that I don't think we'll see that with Yurcich. We'll get more into quarterbacks running in a little bit because he did bring up that as well. But kind of like you said, I think it was just a good introductory press conference, good football mind. It really does seem like we'll get back to like a more Joe Moorhead style offense for this Penn State team, but not fully, because we have to bring this up early in the episode. Probably the biggest quote for social media during this press conference was, and I'm going to quote this, "I love power football. It's how I was raised. There is a time to go under center." And then he continued on, "I think it provides a lot of advantages. The fullback gives you good angles and leverage." Penn State could very well end up back under center once again after a long absence from that.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought this up. This is exactly what I wanted to talk about because this also stood out to me and probably every single Penn State fan during this press conference because he was asked about, I believe it was the Altoona Mirror's Neil Riddell, who's the annual asker of the fullback question on the beat now. But yeah, he was asked about what is your thought on power football, the fullback and all that stuff. And Yurcich wasn't shying away from it at all. And I mean, this is what I think is really intriguing as him coming in as offensive coordinator, because usually you would hear like, well, we're a spread-based offense. We're going to primarily run out of the gun. I mean, you can still get these things done through a gun and all that. But he kind of went into, like, he said what he believes. And he was saying how, yeah, there's a time to go under center. He said playing with a fullback, whether we call him a tight end or a fullback, you're trying to insert a lot of times and create that extra gap. When he's in the backfield, you're able to insert a multitude of gaps so they don't know exactly where it's going to fit. So that fullback does give you good angles and good leverage, allows you to complement yourselves. He was he was talking highly of the fullback. And even at one point he was talking about red zone efficiency, somewhere where Penn State really struggled throughout this entire year. If he was like, guys, if you look at which schools have the highest red zone scoring percentages, year in and year out. It's triple option teams. It's teams like Army and maybe they're running primarily triple option offenses. And that makes me think that maybe he is going to be able to implement. I mean, I don't think there's been a single play run under center in James Franklin's tenure at Penn State. I don't think there's even been one play, even if they're taking a knee. A lot of times they do it out of that short gun. Like this would be unheard of. And that's where I'm really interested to see, because I feel like Franklin and Yurcich have a unique relationship where Franklin has more trust in him than he's had in maybe some more than any offensive coordinator he's had his entire time here. Does he give Yurcich the keys to be like, maybe we'll implement some West Coast stuff, play action passes, power football? Because, I mean, they have the personnel at running back to do it with Noah Cain coming back as a downhill runner, and you have the depth at running back. And another thing that, two things quickly that stand out is Yurcich talked about how key it was in his development as a coach and as a play caller and coordinator that in his early years, especially back with Indiana, he learned a lot of key West Coast offensive principles that he's taken with him. And it sounds like he's a guy who's pretty fond of a West Coast offense, which is primarily going to be based under center, based off play action, getting quarterback on the run first football. And then he also talked about, he talked a lot about he talked a lot about personnel and just how he wants to be able to use personnel, and with the amount of the type of players he's going to be able to recruit at Penn State, that they're kind of going to be able to, they're going to have playmakers and they're just going to have to figure out the best way to use them. And so I'm interested to see how much influence he has on this offense, because I feel like for the last, even there have been 4 offensive coordinators in the last 5 or 6 years now with this program, but all the offenses kind of had the same shell as the others. What his influence is going to look like this season is going to be something to keep an eye on, especially through spring practices.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think going back to some of the power football. I mean, I know when I heard that triple option line, I mean, I thought that was really cool. That's never something it's not something I've ever heard before, but it does make total sense. I mean, I think Yurcich did kind of talk throughout the press conference just in general about quarterbacks taking hits, whether it is in the red zone or out of the red zone. I know he was talking about how in the red zone, everything's tighter. So there's a lot tougher to, there's a lot more people in the box and that sort of thing. So it is tougher to establish the run game with the running back. So when you add a quarterback run option there, your chances of scoring a touchdown are going to be higher. And that makes total sense. I mean, that seems very reasonable. It's just, I know he brought up Patrick Mahomes, and like he ran like an option with the Chiefs in the divisional round of the playoffs. Of course, left the game with a concussion. The Browns couldn't close the deal there. And Mahomes was able to return, and of course he'll be playing in the Super Bowl on Sunday. But he brought up that as like a point of like how much it's a risk reward when you run the quarterback like that. And of course we saw Penn State last year run the quarterback constantly. And then you saw Penn State bring in Will Levis, who we'll get to in a little bit. And he's a quarterback who's going to be leaving the program running the ball more than he's passed the ball. So, I mean, things like that are going to be interesting to see, because it really does seem like, this is getting back to what you were saying, is that there could be kind of a philosophy change here to the way Penn State does their offense. Because like you said, the offense, there have been a lot of different offensive coordinators, but it has been the same base shell of an offense. It has been a spread look. It hasn't necessarily been tempo, but it definitely has been no huddle for no circumstances under center. A lot of RPO stuff, a lot of read option stuff, that sort of thing. And then some deep shots thrown in there here and there to keep a defense honest. But I think Yurcich brings, and what he talked about, he could bring the possibility of kind of really changing this offense, mixing some of those West Coast philosophies into the modern game, into a modern spread college offense. And I think things like that are really entertaining. I think that is kind of the future of where we see offenses going. I think you see that a lot in the NFL, where teams are using old West Coast philosophies mixed into more of a spread look and sort of things like that. So I think that's kind of where offenses are going in the game of football in general. But I think it will be very interesting to see what kind of blending goes on there, how often Penn State will go under center, if they will, what that's going to look like. I mean, I know when you are Penn State has the personnel to do that. With as deep as Penn State is at fullback, and of course teams don't recruit fullbacks anymore, and Yurcich touched on this too. It's not the late 90s where you bring in good fullback prospects. Teams just use tight ends as fullbacks because they are bigger, more athletic, and can pose a lot of different threats in the passing game and whatever out of the backfield, as well as being a big body to block and that sort of thing. So tight ends will play as fullbacks in this type of offense in the modern game. We've seen that with Penn State using them as like H-backs and that sort of thing to get more football technical. But overall, I mean, I think Penn State has that depth at the tight end position where they could do some fun things out of a formation with a fullback, with a tight end with like a Theo Johnson there or something like that. That would be really, really cool. I think there's a lot of possibilities there, especially like play action passes down in the red zone. I mean, are you going to, in that instance, stack the box and try to stop a Noah Kane downhill power runner? Or are you going to respect the play action? Or are you going to watch, you know, Parker Washington who could run a quick slant and score? I mean, there's a lot of different things Penn State could do there in the red zone in that sort of formation. So I think it's very exciting to see kind of how that will all come together. But the last point you brought up before you threw it to me and I got all off topic there was about spring practice and kind of how we are going to learn a lot more about this team through spring practice. And I mean, Yurcich wouldn't touch on any individual specific players in this press conference. He was asked about the quarterback room, which we're going to get to very soon. I know I keep teasing that, but he said, to quote him, I think it's best for me to approach this very non-judgmental when he was asked about, you know, Sean Clifford's abilities as a starting quarterback. And then he said he wanted to get spring practice under his belt before kind of giving an assessment on players and starting jobs and whatever. So it really does seem like this team's going to come in with a blank slate. It seems like every position really is going to be up for battle. And I think this spring practice is so crucial for Penn State. I mean, we saw Shiraka come in last year, didn't have a spring practice, couldn't really instill that offense fully. And then we kind of saw the product on the field in the fall. So I think the spring practice is so important for this Penn State offense, not only for determining who's going to be in key positions, but also just to get a base knowledge of the offense and to be able to start those building blocks that we'll see in the fall where pretty football can happen then.
Yeah, definitely. And even in that press conference, Yurcich mentioned how at Texas last season, they didn't have spring practice either. And he said, yeah, it's obviously going to make things more difficult. And so that makes this year's spring practice, as you could maybe even say this is like the most important spring practice in Penn State football history, considering they didn't have it last year. They're bringing so many guys back, especially on the offensive end, yet presumed starting quarterback, Sean Clifford is on his third offensive coordinator in as many years. What kind of a toll does that take mentally? How tough is it when you're not getting in a rhythm on building on the same offense for years and years, like within the program? Like you're having to learn new concepts, new formations, new just offensive philosophies and probably different rules within situations that certain coordinators want you to abide by. And that's changing year by year. And that certainly can't be easy. James Franklin has even said it. You want continuity within your coaching staff, within your offense, within your systems, but especially with the way college football is right now and how fluid movement is between assistants and coordinators and GAs and stuff like that. It's not necessarily the reality. And yeah, this spring practice is going to be really interesting. I think that in terms of, like you said, a lot of positions could be up for grabs. New offense being implemented. It's going to be key for them to be operating at a full go in spring practice and getting the most out of it that they can, considering they didn't have it last year. And you saw especially early in the year, Sean Clifford wasn't necessarily playing poorly. Like he ended up finishing, if not top in passing yards in the Big Ten at the end of the season. He was in the top 3 or 5. And the whole issues were turnovers, overthrows, and little things in the beginning of the year. And how much of that can you attribute to maybe not being as comfortable or not being just as locked in on the offensive end with the system that you're working on? I mean, it certainly has to play a part. And if Penn State's able to kind of right the ship in terms of being able to just get more and more preparation this year with everything we've heard from Yurcich and how I guess the vibe I've gotten from him of how he sees the game, I think that this could be a huge step in the right direction for them in this spring practice.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, tons of opportunity for growth. And Penn State's offense is a relatively young group. So, I mean, I think there's tons of potential there, tons of growth. I think it's getting that continuity, just getting those reps under their belt. And I think we just saw that in the fall as the season went on. Things got a lot better. But now I think we'll turn to what I've been teasing a couple of times, kind of the big question mark for this Penn State team. The thing that's been talked about the most is the quarterback position and, what's next for it at Penn State. I mean, Yurcich was quoted saying he wants, a playmaker under center, just someone who will make good decisions. He's said that he's won with all kinds of quarterbacks, which he has, whether it's Mason Rudolph, Justin Fields, or Sam Ehlinger last year in Texas. I mean, he has dealt with very different quarterbacks in his time as an offensive coordinator. He said he's dealt with people who run first, people who pass first. It's whatever. He just wants someone throws accurately, makes smart decisions, and is a leader. Where his base qualities he really wants in a quarterback. As we kind of look at the Penn State roster here as it gets into 2021, of course, we don't have like an official roster yet. That'll come out later this spring as Penn State gets ready for spring practice. But Penn State only has 3 scholarship quarterbacks now on its roster heading into the spring. As of now, of course, things could always change with the transfer portal. But quarterbacks Micah Bowens, Will Levis are both in the transfer portal. Both have left the program, so they will not be back. So right now, your quarterback options for Penn State are Sean Clifford, Taquan Roberson, or for incoming freshman Christian Valu, which I think we both agree that's how you pronounce his last name, coming from Canada into Penn State, continuing that Canadian connection recruiting-wise. But if you're Penn State, I mean, you now quarterback-wise really don't have a lot of depth, and it's kind of uneasy, and they're just kind of not really sure where they're going to go, what they're going to do. I mean, I think you're at this point where, in a weird way, you could kind of see any of the 3 of them starting when the season gets underway in the fall. I mean, I don't really know what's going to happen at the quarterback position. I think it's really is going to depend on spring practice.
Yeah, the way I see it right now, especially with how the end of the season went about in 2020, it's Clifford's job to lose. Of course, considering behind him are Taquan Roberson, who's taken maybe 5 snaps in his entire career at Penn State, and an incoming true freshman in Christian Valu. It's an odd quarterback room when you have 3 of the 5 guys of the scholarship quarterbacks enter the portal, with Will Levis leaving, who was the backup, who was even got the starting job at one point last season, and then you mentioned Micah Bowens, who's now at Oklahoma. It's a tough spot because, I mean, even if the 2020 season hadn't started the way it did with Clifford's struggles, you'd look at this situation and you'd say, okay, maybe this isn't that bad. We've got our guy, Sean Clifford. Taquan Roberson is a guy that has a ton of potential to be a dual threat guy and come in and maybe can use this season to really focus on being that number 2 option and preparing like he's a number 2 option with the potential to maybe be in there as a backup if needed. But with the uncertainty of Clifford's play, I mean, he had to be benched at one point last season. And if something similar happens to start the season and this is your quarterback room, I don't know how you can feel confident if you're Mike Yurcich or James Franklin in turning to Roberson or Valu this season. I think it's a very, very interesting spot for this Penn State team. And I want to ask you, on a scale of 1 to 10, how necessary do you think it is for Penn State to go out and bring in another quarterback, with 10 being absolutely necessary and 1 being not at all?
I mean, at this point, I would say probably a 6 or a 7 for Penn State getting a transfer quarterback. I think if Penn State doesn't bring in a quarterback in the transfer portal, I don't think it's the end of the world. I mean, I think I'm fairly confident. I don't really know what could happen because, new offensive coordinator, new coaching staff, whatever. But I think Sean Clifford will probably be the starting quarterback the first game of the fall. If I were to bet on it, that's what I would do. So I think Sean Clifford, you would see him start the first game. But I think just also injury wise, I mean, if someone gets hurt, I mean, you're down then to 2 scholarship quarterbacks, no matter what quarterback would get an injury. I mean, I think it also goes back to kind of last year as well. I mean, I think if we saw more of Taquan Roberson, I think it'd be easier to make a informed decision here. I don't know. He barely played. I mean, I think the only snaps he saw was in the Illinois game at the end of the season. It was 5-6 snaps. I mean, I don't have his stat sheet up here, but he really didn't get meaningful playing time in any game. And I know a lot of fans were calling for him at certain points in the season. And I mean, I think it would have made a lot more sense, especially now. I mean, in hindsight's 2020, but with Will Levis entering the transfer portal and leaving the program, it would have been worth it to get Roberson out on the field, get him some experience, kind of evaluate him in a better way. I mean, I think that would be the big appeal for Penn State, I think, in bringing in a transfer quarterback would be getting someone who has some experience, what they can do on the field. And I think I'm kind of be interested to see where Penn State goes, though, because I also think if they go out into the transfer portal, and I'm not 100% up to date on exactly what quarterbacks are in the transfer portal right now, like what Penn State's best options would be, but it's like Penn State's not going to be able to get a top tier transfer quarterback because no one that's going to transfer into this position where you have a quarterback like Sean Clifford, who's already been the established starter. Like nothing is going to be given to you if you transfer to Penn State to play quarterback. So I mean, I think that's going to hamper Penn State a little bit in the transfer portal. I mean, I think if you're a Division I athlete, if you're transferring, you're going to have to bet on yourself to a certain extent. So you're going to have to bet on yourself that you can beat Sean Clifford out for the starting job. But I think that's something to keep in mind too, is that Penn State's a little less attractive because of that. I mean, I don't think, but to bring it back to what you asked, I don't think it's a failure. I don't think the season's doomed if they don't bring in a transfer quarterback. I feel like it wouldn't be a bad thing. It would probably only benefit Penn State to have a little bit more depth at the quarterback position, another option, someone else to kind of throw in this new offense, see how it works in spring practice, especially if it's an experienced veteran player. I think that would help Penn State. But overall, I don't think it's a failure or they're doomed should they not land a transfer quarterback.
Yeah, I think my thoughts are along the same lines in terms of me. I think that what the coaching staff does in terms of if they do or do not bring in a transfer quarterback is going to tell us, one, a lot about how confident they are in Clifford as their starter, and two, how confident they are in the progress that Roberson has made over the last year and a half, I'd say. Because we haven't gotten to see a lot of him, but they're seeing much more in practice. They're evaluating him week in and week out. And I mean, I think that, you brought up a great point that something I wanted to touch on is that I last week I wrote about potential quarterback targets in the portal for Penn State. And I mainly touched on the highest rated guys by 247 that are in the portal, guys that were high recruits coming out of high school and are looking to move. But those guys aren't necessarily that realistic to bring into this program, because who is going to want to come into a program where there's already what you would have to call an established starter as Sean Clifford? Because if you're a top quarterback transfer, like you're not going somewhere to like win a quarterback battle. You're going somewhere for a guaranteed starting job, because that's the whole reason you're transferring in the first place, most likely. You see it with Dylan McCaffrey, a guy who's a very highly regarded quarterback prospect, goes to Michigan out of high school, isn't getting the reps he likes, doesn't look like he's going to be starting. He transfers to Northern Colorado this year to go play for his dad, Ed McCaffrey, which is a big deal, a big reason why he made that transfer. But going from Michigan to Northern Colorado, just so you can be a starting quarterback, like that's how important it is for these guys to be getting starting reps. Like you can't make a leap to the next level if you don't have starting tape and a good amount of it. And so guys in the portal right now that I jotted down for Penn State that I wrote about last week is Austin Kendall from West Virginia, potentially. There's Luke McCaffrey, Dylan McCaffrey's brother, looking to get out of Nebraska. I think Luke McCaffrey is an interesting prospect in terms of like he's kind of like Tommy Stevens and Will Levis, almost a little bit like meshed together, a little bit smaller stature, but he's a run first quarterback that has the ability to throw it here and there. I mean, there's Tate Martell, who's in the portal. He's pretty much projected to go to UNLV. But I mean, he is in there. There's a guy like Cord Sandberg, 26-year-old quarterback at Auburn right now, who spent time playing in the minors with the Philadelphia Phillies. There's a lot of options out there, but I think the most likely scenario is probably some transfer from a smaller school who's proved to be a quality quarterback, looking to make a leap up the ranks, up the totem pole per se, to maybe get some more attention to himself. who's maybe okay with coming in with a chip on his shoulder and wanting to win out a quarterback battle, or okay with maybe sitting for a year, letting Clifford play this season, and then maybe trying to win the job the next year. I think that's the most likely situation. But I don't think anyone would have thought that. I mean, the Levis transfer was somewhat foreseeable, because when you get in and you get a taste of like, oh, okay, I've been a starting quarterback, I think I can do this, you could assume that maybe he's wanting to look to go get a bigger role somewhere. But for them to also lose Bowens and now to kind of look at the quarterback room like, oh wow, we need to do something about it, is something that I don't think anyone foresaw. And the next steps will be interesting. If they don't bring anyone in, it's definitely not the end of the world. But I mean, anything can happen in football, especially. We saw it last year. By week 5 or 6, Penn State was starting their 4th and 5th string running backs. It's if that's the case with quarterbacks, if something horrible were to happen, you're starting walk-ons in key games. And depth is so crucial, as we learned over the course of this last season more than any other year. And I think that's the biggest piece, is either bring someone in who can compete with Clifford to be a starter, or if anything, for the added depth.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I could see Penn State doing exactly what you said and bringing in a guy from a smaller program who has shown some promise to kind of push Clifford, push for that starting job. I think it also does go back to Taquan Roberson. I mean, how confident is Penn State in him? What has he shown them? How has he developed? I mean, we have no clue, because he didn't get any game time, really, at all. I mean, I don't know if that is kind of showing that the coaching staff doesn't have a lot of confidence in him. I don't know if that's just James Franklin wanting to give Will Levis reps in that situation where they're putting in a second string quarterback. But I mean, I think everyone probably would have liked to see a little bit more of Taquan Roberson this last season, just to kind of see where he's rated, how he's developed. I mean, he's a kid who came in, a lot of accolades, highlights, how to recruit, but we'll kind of see how it plays out. I mean, I think we're very interested in the quarterback position, obviously so key to a team. I think you also have to keep in mind, as of right now, Penn State starts the season at Wisconsin. They'll have Auburn as well in the first 3 weeks. So, I mean, that could be a tough situation to have a quarterback making, their first start or whatever going into that. But of course, who knows if that all, it's so subject to change, as we are here in February looking ahead to August, and who knows where the state of the world will be at by then. But that's a whole different podcast topic and episode. But I think it'll be interesting to see what happens. I mean, I think it'll definitely be. We haven't had quarterback drama like this at Penn State for a little while. I mean, we had some Trace McSorley, Tommy Stevens battle. I mean, that was something that happened. But I think we haven't had this much quarterback drama in a little while. So it'll be kind of interesting to see how this plays out. Will Penn State bring someone in? Will they not? What's going on there? We're going to learn that all in the coming weeks, probably before spring practice, especially because of how much your church placed an importance on that. But that's going to do it for this episode of the Collegian Football Podcast. We just want to pop in, touch on the Yurchich opening press conference, as he was first time answering questions in the media, just his introduction, give you a little insight into some of his philosophy, some of the things he said, kind of the direction that this Penn State offense could take when they get back in the field in the spring and eventually back in Beaver Stadium in the fall. But that's going to do it for this episode. Thanks for listening in. If you're on YouTube, I hope you enjoyed seeing our faces. Subscribe to the Collegian YouTube channel. There's a couple other podcasts going on here, as well as just other video content, news and sports. So make sure to subscribe to the Collegian YouTube channel. But make sure to stay tuned to the Collegian for all of your Penn State football coverage. Follow our website, collegian.psu.edu. Follow us on Twitter @PSUFootball. And thanks for listening.